So obviously we're having this conversation today at a time where we're experiencing an unprecedented amount of industrial militancy, of trade union action, of strikes, of industrial action. And that's the biggest kind of wave of industrial action we've seen in the UK for a generation. I wanted to ask you what the Scottish Green Party Trade Union Group is doing at the moment to support workers in those struggles.
One of the things that we've been doing is raising money for the striking trade unions. So in August, we had solidarity fundraiser in collaboration with the Rainbow Greens, and we raised about £600 in the space of an evening. And that was raising money for striking unions throughout 2022 and going forward. And what also we've been doing is basically approaching trade unions and collaborating with them to bring legislation through to the Scottish Parliament, because we don't take their support for granted. We really have to earn it. And I'm sure Niall would be able to build on that.
Yeah, I suppose it's worth saying, Jen and I took over the co-convener roles in June. Since then, we've met with, I think, over 20 unions, which I suppose is a drop in the ocean of how many there are in the UK that are active at the moment, particularly with the amount of industrial action, like you said, Chris. But, we have had meetings with everyone from Unite, who obviously are Labour affiliated, all the way to the IWGB and different branches of the UVW, who are independent. So, we are trying to cover as many bases as possible. And the other thing we're saying is, we've had meetings with people at Unite, what Jen mentioned about the Get Me Home Safely campaign, about legislation that, Maggie Chapman, who's one of our MSPs and I think has been on Bright Green Live before, she's bringing legislation through the Scottish Parliament. We had spoken about that with both Maggie and the team at Unite back in July when we first met them. And, this is kind of built up over the last 6 months, and Maggie's taken that on kind of full throttle. And, that's not to even mention the work that gets done at council level, and with different green councillors across Scotland. So, there is a significant amount of work that we are. I see us as facilitators, really, because what we do is we put people in touch. The Greens do occasionally have, whether it's a perceived one or a real one, there is a bit of a class issue with the Greens. Whether we're seen as the middle class, kind of green Tories or environmental Tories, or whether we're seen as just young people who are a bit too idealistic. We can't really win in that sense. So what we do is put a kind of definitive face on trade unionism and kind of working class values, and I suppose a point of contact. So GMB got in touch with us during one of their disputes in September, I think, and we immediately set up a meeting with, I think we had 5 of our 7 MSPs who came along to that. That was great, and that meant the GMB had a direct line to our elected members. So, we don't really, we aren't decision makers in that sense. We have politicians and kind of internally elected members who do that. But I suppose what we do is give workers a voice, both people who are Green members and are trade unionists, but also workers who we would want to be Green members, would want to be Green voters, and should be Green voters, quite frankly.
Aye, because our primary purpose is to get Greens involved in the trade union movement and to build those links coming out from us, so that then they come back to us, and creating that mutual link. Because historically, trade unions might have been suspicious of the Green movement at best. And the best thing that we can do is just approach them with good faith and build those collaborations and show that we are actually serious and sincere about working with them, because they're not like our personal lobbying arms, they're not our personal piggy banks, they're fellow democratic organizations that we have to approach in good faith and push our mutual interests, and show that green issues are not this kind of esoteric middle class concern, but they actually are working class issues. And people at the bottom of capitalism are the ones who are at the sharpest end of the stick when it comes to these things.
So you touched on it a little bit there, and I want to pick up on it a little bit more. I wondered if you could talk about why you think it's so important for Greens in particular to support the struggle of trade unions.
Because I think that Green values and trade union values are very similar. They're intrinsically linked. If you want a society that is based on social equity and local democracy, then you're going to want to support trade unions, because we spend most of our lives in the workplace. So having worker-owned, worker-controlled workplaces is how we build democracy from the ground up, and how we distribute wealth and power to historically marginalized groups within society. And if workers aren't involved in the process of decarbonization, democratization, then what's going to happen is that we're going to sleepwalk into a society where the usual suspects, the people who have benefited from colonial capitalism and environmental destruction, just change their suits, and then the historic structures of inequality are unaddressed.
I suppose it's probably worth saying, Chris, that obviously Jen touched on a lot of the kind of democratic side of things. There is the environmental side as well, and I've written it down because I made some notes beforehand, and I wrote down no jobs on a dead planet, because I realise it's a cliche, and I realise that it's something that if you're watching this video, you're probably well aware of. But it's really worth saying that a lot of the worst offenders are the same people. The worst offenders when it comes to workers' rights, when it comes to pay, when it comes to conditions, are the exact same people who are kind of just pushing ecological crime. Fundamentally, these people should be in court for multiple reasons, and often, if it's an environmental group like Just Stop Oil, they don't have a direct line to that. Trade unions give people a direct line to leadership of companies, to leadership of workplaces, and it gives a level of accountability that just wouldn't be there otherwise. And it's fundamental to the green movement that we have that direct line to leadership. Look at the rail strikes are a perfect example. The RMT have been out for I suppose months now. Quite frankly, it's over 6 months. They've been out, and they've settled in Scotland, but there is obviously still the Network Rail issue, and we've been on picket lines with the RMT. We have RMT members within the trade union group who are very active. They take a very strong line on this, which is great. But one of the reasons we should be supporting them is you've got John Bosco on from We Own It later on. Real ownership is a real issue. We've got private companies who are the ones. Obviously there's the government have a say in this due to contract, but fundamentally we have private companies who are dictating what should be public infrastructure, which would make a massive environmental difference, and in doing so they're absolutely shafting workers. Those two things are intrinsically linked, and it's, I suppose, our job to an extent to show your kind of greener Greens within the Scottish Greens and down south and worldwide. I suppose there should be that kind of conversation, but it's down to us to an extent to point that out and make sure that there's still a light being shone on that constantly.
I just wanted to add that a central green issue would be having good accessible public transport that is affordable for everybody, and that's like a workers' issue as well. If you live in, for instance, a car dependent city, the cost of owning and maintaining a car has a downward effect on your wages. If you're on a low income, that's going to have a disproportionate effect on you and your economic opportunities and your ability to contribute to the local economy. So taking these kind of esoteric issues and translating them into concrete talking points that have a real effect on workers' lives is how we win the argument, is how we are able to push for these changes that not just help the planet, but also help workers.
So I've got two more questions I wanted to put to you, but before I go to them, I just wanted to, for everyone watching, encourage you to pop any questions that you have for Jen and Niall in the chat, and I'll try and pick up as many of them as possible at the end. So before we go to questions from the chat, you've mentioned, the two of you, some of the work that's already been done by the Scottish Greens, for example, the Get Me Home Safely campaign, and Maggie Chapman championing that in the Scottish Parliament from the work that Unite has done. And I wanted to sort of ask you whether there were any particular other areas of policy that you want to push for within the Scottish Greens to shift the party's policy, but also to get MSPs pushing on at a parliamentary level.
I suppose we're quite early this year, so as a Democratic Party, we have a cycle where policy can be kind of created and influenced by regular party members, which fundamentally that's all Jen and I are, which is great that we have that kind of voice, but it does mean that we will have to be prepared, and we have other jobs, we have full-time jobs that mean that we have to balance things. And one thing we're really keen to do is, it's only January, we're only just over a week into the new year, but we're already thinking about conference for next year and bringing forward policy ideas. So that conversation is just about to start. We have in recent months been talking to unions a fair amount about the National Care Service. So obviously, for people who are watching from outside Scotland, or who might not be aware, part of the Scottish Government's deal with the Scottish Greens is that there will be legislation brought forward on the creation of a National Care Service in Scotland in some shape or form. However, since the discussions have started at Holyrood level, there have been some concerns raised by unions, not just any in particular, but the STUC, for example, who are obviously the membership body for unions, as well as Unite, the GMB, Unison, who have all been very helpful in getting in touch with us. Gillian Mackay leads on that for the Greens at Parliament level. We had the last thing we did before we took a break over Christmas, and the last thing we did before we came on today, Chris, really for us, although it has been a month, was we hosted the discussion with a Green councillor, Claire Miller, Gillian Mackay, and then we had representatives from Unite, the STUC, and Unison on to talk about the National Care Service and where we go from here and how we can improve it. I said it earlier on, we are largely facilitators, but we do have a massive say in what we focus on. I get the impression the National Care Service will be a large part of that, just because of how broad it is. It covers adult social care, that kind of thing as well, and with things like the privatisation angle, or the privatisation versus public ownership angle, as well as collective bargaining, that kind of thing. It is still up in the air as to whether any or all of that could be included in the National Care Service bill and whether it should be. And I suppose that's going to be a big focus for us in the next few months anyway. Again, you don't know what's going to happen. There could be another pandemic around the corner, but if I was a betting man, I would suggest that'll take up a fair bit of our time in the next few months.
Was there anything you wanted to add, Jen?
The only thing that I was going to add was, so at our last autumn conference, we passed a motion supporting the STUC Scotland Demands Better campaign, and that was a collaboration with STUC, Poverty Alliance, Living Rent, a whole bunch of trade unions operating in Scotland. That was ahead of the budget, pushing for more progressive income taxation, new local taxation to redistribute wealth, property taxes, municipal energy companies, fair work enforcement, a lot of things which were already in the Green Manifesto in 2021, and a lot of things that we went into we're pushing for when we signed up to the Butte House Agreement. And the way that I see it is that the STUC's campaign, the People's Plan for Action, is what gives more strength to the Butte House Agreement. It gives more of a backing, so that it's not just the Greens are demanding it, it's also the Greens and the trade unions are demanding it too. And if we can have a united front on that, we can push for more of that, then we're going to get more out of it. And there was some of that in the budget. There was I think 1% was raised on the higher and the top rates of income tax. But I mean, there's more to do, and we can push further on that. So that's what we're just going to be doing in the next couple of months. Is just making sure that this next budget is doing the most that it can to protect the people who are going to be hurt the most by it.
If I could come back in.
Go ahead now, yeah.
One of the things, we've been talking for a wee while now, and I think it's worth underlining that, as well as the MSPs who do fantastic jobs, we do have, a record number of councillors from earlier this year, which if you follow Bright Green, you'll be very aware of, which is great. What I would say is we, as well as kind of big councillor groups in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and then a kind of smaller one in the Highlands, we do have a lot of councillors who are on their own and who don't have the kind of necessary expertise all the time to deal with everything that gets thrown at them. Often they're in smaller branches, so like South Lanarkshire, for example, which is not traditionally a particularly green area, but we got a councillor there for the first time, which is fantastic, and that's down to nothing but hard work there. However, we now have a councillor there who is on her own, and short of the local branch, and Gillian, who's the central MSP for the area, they're kind of left on their own. So one of the things we are looking to do is kind of support councillors as well. It's a lot of the kind of the high level work happens at Holyrood, which is just natural. But we do have excellent councillors, and they put motions forward all the time. They also sift through thousands of pages of paper every single week, and often that's on payments that will affect workers' settlements for the year, or things that will affect jobs going forward. These are important issues that we can help with and we can support with, and we have offered, and there's been a couple of instances so far where people have come to us and say, look, can you give us a hand, because this isn't necessarily in my wheelhouse, or simply they don't have time. Councillors are underpaid and overworked anyway, so giving them something that will require a little bit of background reading is a lot to ask, whereas we're ready-made, union reps, people with expertise in that area, they can come to us and we can help them out, and that's something that I think that when it comes to policy, Jen mentioned local democracy earlier on and affecting change at a very small level. Holyrood's great, but it's a behemoth and it takes time. We mentioned Maggie Chapman try to bring a bill through Parliament. That isn't something that's going to happen in the space of a couple of months. However, we do have motions that can come forward at council every month or so, depending on where you are in Scotland, and those can be kind of put into policy almost immediately, which is it requires work behind the scenes and work for the councillors to try and get support from elsewhere, because we don't have anywhere in Scotland yet where, and I say yet optimistically, we don't have anywhere in Scotland yet where the Greens have kind of a majority on the council or anything like that. We are still, in opposition, or one of the smaller groups in anywhere that we do have representation. But that's somewhere where people can see a very quick response on the ground. And also, if you live in an area, you're more aware of what's going on. So whether that's, You'll Get Me Home Safely started off as a Green councillor motion like in the previous term. It's not even something that's working on now. It predates Jen and I's term. This is something that we're doing, and we want to see more of that, quite frankly. So I think that, as well as pushing at high levels, taxation, that kind of thing, they're really important, but making sure that councillors all across Scotland have support from us is absolutely vital. And we do have a councillor rep, Dan Hutchison, who is one of the fantastic new councillors in Govan, and he's been doing a fantastic job at keeping people in the loop. But we do need more of that. So if we have any councillors who are watching, anyone who has a branch in Scotland who wants a little bit of support from us, just drop us an email, get in touch, and we'll happily have a chat. That's not a problem.
So there are loads of lovely messages in the chat of support for what you've been saying and solidarity, including from I think members of your committee. So Bryce Goodall has said solidarity to Jen and Niall. They're the equalities officer for the trade union group. What we don't have in the chat yet is any questions. So this is my final request for any questions for Niall and Jen before I put my last question to them. Please do get them in now so that I can try and put any that you want to them. So my final question for you is obviously the Scottish Greens are in a unique position for Greens in the UK, in that you're the only Green Party that is currently in government. What do you make of the record of the Scottish Greens in government on workers' rights and on unions?
I'm happy to kick that one off, Jen. One of the things that Jen and I did when we first took over in the summer was that we started a review of the Butte House Agreement. We're over a year in now into the Scottish Greens being in government, and I don't like to make assumptions because everyone has their own opinion on this. Obviously, it was put to a vote of members at that back in August 2021, but we are a year on now. You would expect some sort of movement on things, and what we want to do is touch base with trade unionists in the Scottish Greens and also the elected reps and trade unions to see what they thought of it, quite frankly. So over the last few months, and this is excellent timing, Chris, because they're actually going to publish it tomorrow. But we have been carrying out a review for the last kind of 3 or 4 months or so of what people think. So we've reached out to different trade unions. We've had national secretaries who've kind of given us some feedback, all the way to just our ordinary members of the trade union group in the Greens, who are telling us what they think of the Greens record, what they think has been done well, which there have been undoubtedly have been things that have gone really well. There have been also things that I would argue, and I think the consensus seems to be, that the Greens could have gone slightly further on various things. The National Care Service is one. There's particularly among people who work in the care sector or in the health sector, there is definitely a concern that the National Care Service is not what was promised originally, not just by the Greens, by the SNP as well. And it's important that we make sure that the Greens are held to account for everything that doesn't go well in the next 4 years and for the previous year as well. Worth saying though, the Greens' responsibility, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of lots of our members, is that we are there to push the SNP to do things that they wouldn't normally do. Otherwise, what's the point of us being in government? We need to be pushing them to be more radical. Personally, I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think that a lot of the things that we're seeing that are being bandied around as wins are things that could have happened anyway. For example, income tax going up by a penny and higher rates at the moment. That's not, in my opinion, something that the SNP would have been too scared to do anyway. We are in a cost of living crisis, and the SNP rely on working class votes fundamentally. So, that's something they would have had to consider anyway. We are much closer to what would be considered the default or the establishment position with the budget than what would be proposed by the STUC, for example. And the Greens aren't used to being outflanked by Labour. We aren't, particularly on the left. We have been the radicals in the room pretty much for, well, as long as I've been interested in politics. The Greens have been to the left of Labour on pretty much everything. Even with a Corbyn government, and there's no point in talking about the Labour leadership. Everyone on this call knows that there are flaws there. However, there are MSPs in the Scottish government who are Labour MSPs who are very good at what they do, and they have outflanked the Greens. And I think that that's made a lot of our MSPs uncomfortable, because they aren't used to being the ones who are being challenged. They're used to being the ones who are agitating. And part of that comes with now being in government. So obviously there is a lot of pressure on people to, there's the kind of secrecy element to the Scottish government where things need to be under wraps all the time. There is the working with another party that, again, is a new thing for us. However, what I would say is, we got some wins in the House Agreement, and some of those are already coming to fruition. We have workers' representation on college boards now, which Ross Greer announced at the end of last year. We have things like conditionality in public contracts where workers' rights will be prioritised. Those are all extremely, extremely valuable. However, we do have people who don't work in the public sector, don't work in education, who will be, quite frankly, hung out to dry by policies of the Scottish government. And unfortunately, the Greens have to take responsibility for that now. We are in government. We have ministers, and we have MSPs who will be voting through budgets, will be voting through legislation that will affect the day-to-day lives of people across Scotland, in rural areas, in cities, everywhere, who are already struggling more than they have done possibly their whole life. Particularly for people, I'm almost 30. This is the most financially unstable I've been in my adult life, and that'll be the case for a lot of people. And for the Greens to kind of, quite often there's a lot of uncritical support for what the Greens are doing in government. And again, I would underline that this is my opinion, not the opinion of the trade union group as a whole. I would underline that I think there could be a lot more done. And quite frankly, if the Greens are uncomfortable with what the SNP are proposing, no one's tying us to government. That's something that there is a democratic mandate that took us into government, and there is the mechanism there for that to be reversed. Whether I think that's the case and whether I think that's what needs to be done at the moment, I'm not entirely sure that is. However, I would say that the review of the House Agreement that we will be publishing tomorrow, and that has been that we've spoken to dozens of people, and actually more than half of the Scottish Green councillors responded to us, including some MSPs as well. Even the responses from elected Greens who have power in Glasgow, Edinburgh, the Highlands, even at Holyrood, we have a very clear concern that what was promised does not go as far as people would have hoped, and that we are compromising day in, day out at Holyrood. And I think that there's conversations that need to be had about where we go from here. Just, we're only 18 months in, there's 3.5 years left. So, we have to address that as soon as we can.
And the whole point of the View House Agreement was to use the Greens' unique voice in government to, like Niall said, to push the SNP to do more than they usually would. But it is a discussion worth having. Like, are we getting the most out of this agreement? Is this agreement doing? Is it serving our objectives? One of the things that came out of the budget, like Niall said, the 1p increase on the higher and the top rate. If the higher rate threshold had been moved from 43k to 40k, it would have raised 690 million. And only 10% of people in Scotland pay the higher rate or the top rate. So I looked at that and I couldn't understand why that wasn't even considered, why that wasn't even touched. It baffles me, quite honestly. And it just shows that there was a lot more that could have been done in the budget, but it wasn't. And we in the Greens have this unique responsibility. We have this unique position to push the Scottish government to do more, to go further, to go faster. And no one else in the Scottish Parliament can do that. So it is a discussion worth having. And whatever comes out of that, hopefully it means that we can achieve more of what we want to do, and do the most for the workers in this country.
I suppose, Chris, just to quickly jump back in, if that's okay. I think, Jen mentioned whether that was considered or not, lowering income taxes, and that's not even to mention things like wealth taxes that would raise millions and millions of pounds across Scotland, or the much delayed and much maligned local taxation. So we still suffer under council tax, unfortunately. That's something that could really be addressed with Greens in government. And we've got 3.5 years, we're a year and a half in to an agreement. Those are things that need to be addressed. Not to say that those discussions weren't had. I have no doubt that we have MSPs who are, as far as I'm aware, Ross Greer is the one who talks to John Swinney about what is going to be happening on legislation, the budget, that kind of thing. Primarily they go through those two individuals. I have no doubt that Ross has mentioned those things to John. Like, Ross is a socialist and has been a member of the Greens long before I've been a member of the Greens. But one thing I would say is that I think that sometimes the main issue with what I feel with the Greens in government is I think they underestimate their own power here. I think that they could play their hand a little bit more boldly. And the SNP rely on us. We need to understand that a little bit more. I realise that there is a negotiation and there has to be some sort of accommodation of what the SNP's views are on certain things. However, I do think we need to have a little bit more confidence in ourselves. I think that that's fundamental. And we have excellent staff at Holyrood. We have excellent party staff. We have excellent MSPs. There's absolutely no reason that we couldn't be, quite frankly, pushing the SNP back, pushing them to the edge of what would be, a radical cliff. They quite often creep up there. They don't often jump off that and take any kind of leaps. The Greens need to be the ones who push them, quite frankly.
So we've been talking for just shy of half an hour. So I'm going to put one question to you from the chat, if that's okay, but only one. And it's completely different to what we've been talking about so far, but hopefully will give you some useful insights. So Bryce Goodall asks, what are your thoughts on EU workers' rights being stripped?
I think there's two prongs to that. Thanks for the question, Bryce, I suppose is the first thing to say. There's two prongs to it. The Greens are, I think, it's worth saying that the Greens are fundamentally in favour of the European Union. Again, myself and other people who are trade union members will know from the lengthy discussions that everyone had in 2016 around the EU and whether it's worth staying in the EU. I voted to remain. However, I was in the not insignificant cohort of people, and I think that there was, a large body of people from the Green Party of England and Wales, as well as the Scottish Greens, who say that there needs to be fundamental overhaul of the EU before Scotland was to go back in as an independent country, or I don't think, unfortunately, that there's any kind of case to be made at the moment democratically for the UK to return. But I would say that if Scotland was independent, that's something that could definitely happen. I do think there needs to be fundamental reform, and I do think that those concerns that were raised in 2016 are now being borne out. We have, essentially what is a capitalist system in the EU, which is fundamentally been set up in that way that does not have workers' rights at its heart. The EU is great on many things. Freedom of movement, for example, fantastic. Environmental regulations, also really good. Those are two things that we've noticed are contributing to all the issues that Jen and I mentioned earlier on: cost of living crisis, worker shortages in the NHS, the care service shutting down. Those are all things that have been affected by Brexit and the lack of EU protection. However, one of the things the EU doesn't protect and does not prioritise is ordinary working people like me, like Jen, like Chris, like you, Bryce. I think those are things that we need to be critical of. Again, I mentioned the Greens and the SNP. You can be supportive of the Greens in government, but you can still be critical of it. I think as Greens, as people who support the European Union, we also need to be critical of the European Union and where it needs to improve. Those are things where, Greens are fundamentally internationalist in our nature. We need to be looking to, not just the EU, but further afield, particularly in, kind of lower income countries, what would traditionally have been termed the third world, things like that. These are areas where the Greens in Scotland and across the world, quite frankly, we had a global movement. We need to make sure that these things cross borders. And I think that the EU, as much as they say that, freedom of movement is a fantastic thing, they still see borders, they still see the hoarding of capital in their states as something that is fundamentally a good thing. What they don't see, the way that they don't see it, and the way I think a lot of Greens see it or should see it, is that the EU is a place where workers can be protected, workers can have power, workers can have a voice at every single level of government, all the way from Brussels down to a local town hall in, a very small town in the north of Scotland. That's the kind of thing that should happen in the EU. It should happen. That's the kind of power that people should have. That's the power workers should have in the EU. Unfortunately, I don't think that happens at the moment. Definitely doesn't happen in Scotland. It definitely doesn't happen in the rest of the UK. But even for states that are still in the EU, I don't think it happens either. And that's a very, very disappointing thing.
And honestly, I think it is a case of a trade-off. These systems are never going to be perfect, but we really have to be pragmatic about how we align ourselves as a country. And personally, I think that Scotland's interests would be best served in the European rather than in the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, because of the result of how Brexit went, that is basically the choice Scotland has. When you look at the structures of the European Union, individual member states have more of a say than, say, Scotland would in the United Kingdom. But like I said, these things aren't perfect, and these systems are only as good as the people who end up in charge of them and then use them. So either they could be used to advance workers' rights, they can be used for environmental protection, or they can be used for destroying those rights and for destroying our environment. And ultimately, it is a trade-off, and I do think that like Niall said, we are an international movement. We should be reaching across borders and coordinating across borders, across national lines is ultimately going to be a lot stronger for us than being tied to a Brexit that the majority of people in Scotland didn't vote for.
So we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Jen and Niall, for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much.